Look, nobody likes talking about nuclear weapons. It's like that weird uncle at Thanksgiving. You know he exists, you just try your best to avoid eye contact. But the thing is, we can't just ignore this stuff. Especially now, with Russia increasingly rattling its nuclear saber. And I don't mean in the metaphorical I'm very angry way, but in the much more literal we might actually use these things way. So buckle up because we're diving headfirst into the terrifying yet fascinating world of Russia's tactical nuclear strategy. And just a heads up, it's about as comforting as a bear hug from a grizzly after it's discovered you have a honey allergy. So, what's pushing Russia towards this whole tactical nuke thing anyway? Well, imagine you're playing a really high-stakes game of Risk, right? And you're losing. Badly. Your neighbors are joining alliances you're not invited to, and they're eyeing your territory like it's the last slice of pizza at a college dorm party. That's kind of where Russia finds itself right now. Regional conflicts near its borders, like the ongoing mess in Ukraine, have put Moscow on edge. Add to that NATO's expansion eastward, which, to be fair, is a whole other can of worms we could unpack another time. And you've got a recipe for paranoia and aggression. Russia sees these developments not just as regional spats, but as direct threats to its security and influence. And when you feel cornered, you tend to lash out, right? But here's the kicker. Russia's bark might actually have a bite this time, and that bite could be radioactive. They've been increasingly vocal about their willingness to use nuclear weapons, specifically tactical nukes, in these regional conflicts. Now, before you start digging a bunker in your backyard, let's try to understand what these tactical nukes actually are and why they're causing such a stir. Tactical nuclear weapons sounds almost harmless, right? Like something you'd find in a particularly intense game of laser tag. Don't let the name fool you. These things are still incredibly destructive, just on a smaller scale than the city vaporizing behemoths we typically imagine when we think nuclear war. We're talking about weapons with yields ranging from a fraction of a kiloton to maybe a few dozen kilotons. Tiny compared to the megaton monsters in the strategic arsenal, but still powerful enough to obliterate entire city blocks. But here's where it gets really unnerving. Russia has been pouring resources into modernizing its military, specifically its nuclear arsenal. And a big part of that modernization involves these smaller, more usable tactical nukes. Think of it like this. If strategic nukes are like having a sledgehammer in your arsenal, tactical nukes are like having a set of very precise, very deadly scalpels. They give Russia more options, more flexibility in how and when they might use nuclear weapons, which is frankly terrifying. This modernization drive isn't just about the hardware either. Russia's military doctrine has also undergone a significant shift, moving away from the old Soviet-era emphasis on massive retaliation to a more flexible approach that includes the possibility of using nuclear weapons in a limited regional conflict. In other words, they're lowering the threshold for nuclear use, and that should make everyone very, very nervous. Alright, let's talk military doctrine. I know about as exciting as watching paint dry, but trust me on this one. See, every country with nukes has a plan for how and when they might use them. It's like a really grim instruction manual that hopefully never gets opened. Russia's doctrine, however, has been getting increasingly worrisome. They've basically thrown out the old, mutually assured destruction playbook. You know, the whole if you nuke us, we nuke you back and everyone dies thing, and replaced it with something called escalate to de-escalate. Catchy, right? Here's the gist. Russia believes that in a conventional conflict, if they are losing, they can use a small tactical nuke as a way to shock the enemy into backing down. The idea is to escalate the conflict to a point where the other side blinks first, effectively winning the war by threatening to blow up the chessboard. It's a high-risk, high-reward gamble, and one that assumes the other side will behave rationally in the face of a nuclear detonation. Big assumption, especially when you're dealing with, well, the entirety of human history. This doctrine of escalation completely upends decades of strategic thinking around nuclear weapons. It makes the unthinkable more thinkable, and that's a dangerous game to play. Because once that first nuclear shot is fired, no matter how tactical it might be, all bets are off. Now, for decades, the world has lived under a terrifying, yet oddly stable concept called nuclear deterrence. Basically, it's the idea that no country will use nukes because everyone's too afraid of getting nuked back. It's a bit like a global game of chicken, where the stakes are so high that no one dares to swerve. But here's the thing. Tactical nukes throw a wrench into this whole delicate balance. See, strategic nukes, those city-destroying monsters, are a pretty clear line in the sand. You use one of those, you know you're starting World War III. Tactical nukes, however, blur that line. They introduce an element of ambiguity, of maybe, possibly being able to use a nuke without triggering full-blown Armageddon. At least, that's the theory. The problem is, in the fog of war, things rarely go according to plan. Imagine a scenario where Russia, feeling the pressure in a regional conflict, decides to use a tactical nuke on a military target. The other side, perhaps not believing that Russia would actually do it, is now faced with an impossible choice. Do they retaliate in kind, risking full-blown nuclear war? Or do they back down, emboldening Russia and potentially encouraging further nuclear use? It's a lose-lose situation, and one that could easily spiral out of control. To understand Russia's current nuclear posture, you have to understand their history, their anxieties, their perception of the world. Russia has always been a country with a bit of a siege mentality, a sense of being surrounded by enemies. Centuries of invasions and conflicts will do that to a nation. And in their eyes, the West, particularly NATO, is the latest iteration of that threat. They see NATO expansion as an aggressive encroachment, a betrayal of promises made after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They view Western support for Ukraine as a direct challenge to their interests and influence in their own backyard. Right or wrong, these perceptions are deeply ingrained in the Russian psyche, and they inform their decision-making when it comes to security. Now, add to this mix a healthy dose of domestic politics. Putin's regime thrives on projecting an image of strength, of Russia as a resurgent global power. And what better way to project strength than by brandishing the nuclear sword? It's a dangerous game, but one that plays well to a domestic audience eager for a return to greatness. Here's a chilling thought. What if technological advancements are making nuclear weapons more, not less appealing? It sounds counterintuitive, but stick with me. Remember how we talked about Russia's modernization of its nuclear arsenal? Well, part of that modernization involves developing smaller, more precise tactical nukes, weapons that could potentially be used on a battlefield without triggering global annihilation. At least, that's the sales pitch. These new generation nuclear weapons are more accurate, more controllable, and more adaptable to different battlefield scenarios. They're designed to be usable in a way that their Cold War era counterparts never were. And that's precisely what makes them so dangerous. The more usable a weapon is perceived to be, the lower the threshold for its use becomes. It's like the difference between having a gun locked away in a safe and carrying it around in your pocket. The mere presence of that weapon, the knowledge that it could be used, changes the entire dynamic. And it's not just about the weapons themselves. Advances in targeting technology, intelligence gathering, and cyber warfare all contribute to this sense that nuclear weapons are no longer just instruments of last resort, but viable tools in a modern military arsenal. It's a terrifying thought, but one that we can no longer afford to ignore. The battlefield of the 21st century is a very different place from the battlefields of the past. Gone are the days of massive tank battles and trench warfare. Today's conflicts are more fluid, more asymmetric, more reliant on technology and information. We're talking cyber warfare, drone strikes, autonomous weapon systems, the stuff of science fiction, but very much a reality in modern warfare. And as the nature of warfare evolves, so too do the strategies and doctrines that underpin it. Russia, always a keen student of military history, understands this. They've seen how the West, with its superior technology and air power, has been able to dominate conventional conflicts in recent decades. They know that in a head-to-head confrontation with NATO, they would likely be outmatched. So they're adapting, looking for ways to level the playing field. And one way to do that is by emphasizing their nuclear capabilities, particularly their tactical nukes. In their view, these weapons provide a way to offset Western conventional superiority, to deter aggression, and to ensure that Russia remains a dominant player on the global stage. Let's be honest, domestic politics and international grandstanding often go hand in hand. And in Russia, the connection between the two is about as subtle as a bear doing ballet. Putin's regime has skillfully cultivated a sense of nationalism, of restoring Russia to its former glory. And part of that narrative involves reminding everyone that Russia is a nuclear superpower, a force to be reckoned with. Think of it as a bit of political theater, a way to bolster domestic support and project an image of strength abroad. The problem is, when you play with fire, sometimes you get burned. The more Russia emphasizes its nuclear arsenal, the more it becomes central to their identity as a nation, the harder it becomes to back down from a nuclear threat, even if it's in everyone's best interest to do so. It's a dangerous feedback loop. one where domestic political calculations can have very real and very dangerous consequences on the international stage. And as long as Putin remains in power, it's a dynamic that's unlikely to change. We're living in a time of profound global uncertainty. The old world order, the one that emerged from the ashes of the Cold War, is crumbling. New powers are rising, old alliances are fraying, and the rules of the game are being rewritten. In this volatile environment, nuclear weapons, once seen as relics of a bygone era, are taking on a new and unsettling relevance. Russia, feeling increasingly marginalized and threatened, is looking to its nuclear arsenal as a way to secure its place at the table of great powers. They see the West, distracted by internal divisions and economic woes, as weak and indecisive. And they're betting that by brandishing their nuclear weapons, they can exploit those weaknesses to their advantage. It's a high-risk strategy, one that could easily backfire. But as the global balance of power shifts, as competition for resources and influence intensifies, the temptation to rely on nuclear weapons as a quick and decisive way to achieve geopolitical objectives is likely to grow. And that's a terrifying prospect for all of us. Here's the truly terrifying thing about Russia's nuclear strategy. It's shrouded in ambiguity. They've been deliberately vague about when and how they might use tactical nukes, leaving the rest of the world to guess at their intentions. This ambiguity, while unnerving, is actually a key part of their strategy. By keeping everyone guessing, by refusing to draw clear red lines, they create uncertainty and sow doubt in the minds of their adversaries. It's a classic tactic of psychological warfare, designed to make the enemy hesitate, to second-guess themselves, to ultimately back down from a confrontation. But this calculated ambiguity also carries with it a significant risk of miscalculation. When intentions are unclear, when communication channels are murky, even the smallest incident can spiral out of control. A misinterpretation of a military exercise, a false alarm on a radar system, a cyber attack gone wrong, any of these things could be misconstrued as a prelude to a nuclear strike, leading to a chain of events that quickly escalate into the unthinkable. So, there you have it, a crash course in the terrifying world of Russia's nuclear strategy. And I'll be honest, it's not exactly a comforting thought to end the show on. The truth is, we're living in a world where the unthinkable is no longer impossible, where the lines between conventional and nuclear warfare are blurring, and where the fate of humanity rests on a knife's edge. But here's the thing, just because the situation is dire, doesn't mean we should give in to despair. We can't afford to become numb to the threat, to accept nuclear war as an inevitability. We need to talk about this, to educate ourselves and others about the risks, to demand transparency and accountability from our leaders, because ultimately, the only way to prevent the unthinkable is to confront it head-on, to shine a light on the dangers, to expose the flaws in the logic, and to work tirelessly towards a future where nuclear weapons are nothing more than a distant and hopefully forgotten memory.